So Terry, give me like a 2-minute history about, like what were the sirens that called you to winemaking, and it's specific to Oregon.
Well, it was a combination of things, none of which was a whole lot more important than any other. But I shared the business with my identical twin brother, and we both became interested in this while we were doing something very, very different.
And what was that?
I was a psychologist in Seattle, and Ted, my brother, was teaching history in the University of Michigan system. And what happened is that rather independently, we became interested in wine.
Just drinking wine.
We started to drink wine, and we began to. I had quite a bit more money than I'd ever had in my life because I was making more money than I probably ever have made. But my brother was part of a wine buying club at the University of Michigan that's really has a very long history and got a hold of some very good wine. So when we get together for vacations, we would just really enjoy the fruits of what were available to us. And I think we were at a point, we were in our 30s at the time, and we became interested in doing something other than work with our heads. We've been both been academic people our whole lives and gone to school for way too long. And so we began to talk about this project, and my sister-in-law's father owned radio and TV stations. And he wanted to set Ted and Pat up in business, and he was willing to include us in that picture. So at one point, a friend of ours, Myron Redford, over here at Amity, he'd been an assistant to the provost at the University of Washington, and we had quite a bit of history with him. And he wrote us and let us know that there was this piece of property available in the Yola Hills. And he thought it was a pretty good one, and he encouraged us to take a look at it. So they came, actually they had gone to Davis by then. They quit their jobs in Michigan and had come out and lived with us for a short period of time in Seattle. And
that was Myron?
Myron.
Or your brother?
My brother.
Oh, okay.
And Myron had been here for 4 or 5 years by then. But he encouraged us to come and take a look at it. So we came down from Seattle, they came up from Davis, and we looked at it, and probably 10 minutes into the trip, into the visit here, we were in awe. I think it was very uneducated awe, but we were. But the guy who had originally found this property had really worked at it. He and his father was a marine architect, and they were very excited about this area and had flown over it many times, and were looking for a kind of a mid-slope piece, which this is, that was, had probably about 50 acres of plantable land, and they had purchased it. But when it got around to planting more of it, they'd had it for a couple, 3 years, but what happened is that they had an agreement with their investors, and this was done with an interstate, I don't know what you call them, investment agreement. The powers that be in the government said you have to have your license by X time or you got to give the money back.
Oh, huh. And they wanted to plant vines too.
They actually planted 14 acres.
Okay.
So when we got here, there were just these baby plants out here, and they were on this side of the ravine.
And what were they? What varietal?
There were a bunch of different things.
Oh, is that right?
There was a Chardonnay, one take clone Chardonnay, which has actually served us rather well. There were maybe 3 clones of Pinot Noir in small amounts, and Chenin Blanc. And so we thought, and about 6 acres of Gewürztraminer
Uh-huh.
and a little bit of Riesling. And so we went and consulted with Dick Erath. And about 10 minutes into that interview, his wife of the time turned to Dick and said, "Dick, you should just end this interview. They're going to buy it anyway." She was a very wise woman. So that was where it started. And Ted and Pat moved. This is in 1978. Ted and Pat moved here in, well, maybe April, something like that. And then we had to close down our practices in Seattle, which takes a while. So we didn't come until like September, although we spent a month during the summer.
September what year?
Of 78.
78.
And then in the winter of 78 and 79, we planted 20 acres. We did every bit of it ourselves.
Wow.
It was a real challenge to people who hadn't done any physical work in their whole lives. But it was a very good experience. We really felt tied to the land by the time we were done, and we knew where each vine was and all the problems we had and laying it out. So anyway, we were here and we were into it. I had planned on actually practicing down here as a way of kind of supporting us, but the families decided that we could afford to do it with us just doing all the work. So that's what we did. And for the first 6 years, we were sort of the crew. We began after a while having to hire people to help us. But in 83 approximately, we decided what we would do was just borrow money and start a winery.
Uh-huh. So you were selling the fruit before then?
Yes, we were.
Yeah.
And we built part of this building then, and our first vintage was 1984.
Uh-huh.
The worst vintage Oregon has ever seen. It was it started raining at the end of September, and it never stopped. There were only 5 producers in the state of Oregon that made red wine that year.
Huh.
There was a sea of pink wine out there. And it was so different than 83, which was a beautiful vintage, and made some really luscious, forward wines. We kept thinking, well, 84 is going to be the same way, and it just wasn't.
Yeah.
Lesson number 1 about Oregon. So,
and then 83 got so much acclaim, too.
Yeah, that was the one that Parker discovered. And 85 was a very good vintage. But anyway, we were into it by then, and we sold grapes until probably close to the end of the 80s. David Adelson was a big customer of ours. Domaine Drouin. Bonnie Doon down in California bought we have a clone of Pinot Noir out here called the Gamay Beaujolais clone, because the growth habit looks like a true Gamay, but it's a clone of Pinot, and we sold him that for several years for a white wine he was making.
Huh.
And we sold him Gewürztraminer, which he made into one of his infusions. And we were working toward the place where we would keep all of our own fruit, and that it was sort of the intention.
Yeah.
Speaking of the Yolo Hills, there wasn't much here when we arrived, but that's certainly changed since. Most true. Too far away from Portland to attract major winery investment.
Uh-huh.
But the area is very appropriate to grapes.
What makes it appropriate, and what's the difference between, like the terroir or whatever makes the Eola Hills wine specific from, say, Dundee?
Well, it's the things that, when you begin to talk about terroir, involved in what that is, and how they sort out. Like, this area is also volcanic, basically volcanic, but it's shallower soil than what you get in the Red Hills.
Shallower. So like you've got your basalt underneath, and then like the soil on top. What elevation are you here?
We are sitting right now about 580.
Soil on top is, what kind of soil is that?
Well, it's in the Jory series, but it's mainly Nikaya, which is a shallower version of the Jory series. In the shallower version in the Jory series, we also have some Rittner, which has quite a bit of stone in it. But it means that I think that we probably can't support as large a crops as they can maybe in the hills of Dundee. And the wines tend to be a little more austere, and I think more dark fruited than red fruited. I get a lot of strawberry and the kind of flavor in the Red Hills wines, and down here it's often black cherry and black caneberries, those sorts of things.
What do you think, if you were to kind of speculate, what accounts for that difference? Because it's not very far away, and it's the same volcanic stuff that came through here, and the same floods came through, and
well, I think that some of it probably when the big volcanic action happened in eastern Oregon, it poured in and laid this foundation of volcanic stuff. Probably was thicker in some places than it was in others. That's my speculation, is that we just didn't have as deep of a repository of volcanic stuff. So when the Pacific plate and the continental plate began to push at each other, and these little ripples and folds developed, which are the hill chains, with a shallower base, it would not create as deep a soils. And probably also, the farther up the valley you are, the more, when the Missoula floods came, the more water activity there would have been.
More, what do you mean, more water activity? I mean,
it was flowing more up there, because the farther you get down the valley, it was just filling with water rather than a lot of under more pressure, because it was at the entrance to the valley.
Yeah, but those floods went all the way down to Eugene.
I know, and I don't mean to understand this all the time. The guesses I made over the years. But that's a big factor. The soils are shallower. The other and probably most important factor is the Van Duzer corridor. Van Duzer corridor is a low point in the Coast Range, and it lets the ocean breezes come in the afternoon. And we are closer to it than the Red Hills. At least the way the wind patterns are. They kind of swirl up and around Minville, up to Minville, and then Amity, for instance, which is quite a bit farther north than we are, gets hit by them much more than we do. And how much protection you have. Like, Christum is warmer than we are, because Christum is down the hill from us right over here. But it does mean that we get every bit as warm as any of these sites do during the day. But about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we begin to get a sea breeze that cools things off rather dramatically. And I think that means that the wines have more acidity, not necessarily more sugar, but more acidity, and the balance is a little different. People talk about our wines as being potentially aging a bit better. I think something said a bit more appropriate with food.
More appropriate with food?
Yes, because of the acid backbone. And that's you can even see that in our property from one block to another. mean, this terroir thing can be very global. It can also be very specific.
I remember I was here photographing like when you first made this winery for the architects, and at the end is I think it was Pat said, "Oh, you should try some of these." So I tried 2 Pinots from adjacent blocks.
The flat block and the southeast block.
Just a little road separating them, basically, from my understanding. And you can taste the difference, and that blew me away. It's like I wasn't very sophisticated then, and I just was amazed that you could actually taste the difference. And I kind of just figured, I'd look out there and I think, well, I mean, it's, we're on the same hill, same wind. So I was pretty amazed.
Well, what some French soil people told us, this has been several years ago, is that that little blue toilet thing over there is exactly about the point where there's to the east of that and above it is the flat block, and to the east and south or south of that is the southeast block, and they believe that they probably were formed by separate volcanic events.
Wow. So as the volcanic, as the lava is flowing here, it's like there was one flow, and then another flow came, and it didn't quite cover the first flow or something.
It's something like that. There's more magnesium, and the rock is whiter on the flat block. Wow. And the southeast block, it's a deeper red, more the typical big boulder basalt stuff. And we had intellectually prepared ourselves for terroir. We believed in it because it made a lot of sense. But we actually learned about it from our own property.
When you were out there digging the holes and planting
that, and also just when we began to make wine, we kept everything separate.
Each block separate?
Each block separate. And to be honest, I mean, the blocks were not formed for reasons of terroir. We were trying to cut things up so we could get an irrigation system. So, everything's somewhat serendipitous. But it did end up, I think, making sense. Some years it's more apparent than others.
What's that about then?
I don't know. I mean, I've thought about that quite a bit, and I think the 05s are less distinctive from one another than the 06s. The 06s are, to me, very distinctive from that.
The blocks.
Yes.
Just out of curiosity, what's the distance between those two blocks at the closest points?
It's probably 20 feet.
20 feet. Boggles my brain. So, what does a winemaker bring to the bottle?
Well, he brings, first of all, his or her own palate. I think that's pretty important.
Do you need to catch that? Go for it.
It's probably my son. He's a little late this morning. Telling me he's going to get here. Okay, your question again?
What does the winemaker bring to? You were talking about the palate and how important the palate is, and I'm kind of curious about that.
Well, I think that whether you like it or not, or that's really inappropriate way to put it. Whether it's something you want or your own bias in terms of balance in Pinot Noir makes a big difference in the way you approach your winemaking.
Now, when you say bias, explain that just a little bit. I'm not sure what.
I think that some people really do like the biggest wine they could possibly make. They're power winemakers because that's the kind of wine they like. And then other people really prefer balance and finesse in their wines. And that has a lot to do with what you're working in the winery. I mean, you're trying to please yourself. I think it would be inappropriate to say you're not. But it's also true that the other piece of that, in terms of motivation, is you got to sell the stuff, and it makes a difference there if you see the market as wanting power wines, or you think you're going to do better with something that's more delicate, perhaps more complex. So I think that's a big piece of it. There are a lot of techniques. I mean, and they're not secrets. We all know what they are.
Like what, for example?
Okay, for an example, power wines. How much do you work at extracting?
Extracting
the flavor and aroma from well, most of the flavor and aroma is in the skins. My brother says, as growers, he's growing grape skins. When you harvest, how small the berries are, all that kind of thing are factors in the raw material that you bring into the winery and that you have to work with. But you can punch down 2 times a day, you can punch down 3 times a day, you can get things to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, or you can get them to 280 or 75. Each one of those makes a difference in degree and quality of extraction. You can pick late, or you can pick early. You can leave the grape must in the fermenter longer, which is what we call post-fermentation maceration. You can do a cold soak.
Cold soak, what's that?
Cold soak is when you bring the grapes in and destem or not, put the must, the juice must in your fermenter, and then by use of refrigeration, get it cold, and then it won't ferment. And you leave it for as long as you want. What you're doing then is you're soaking those skins that my brother talks about being so important in an aqueous solution rather than an alcohol solution. And you get different extraction in water than you do in alcohol.
And what's the difference in the final?
A lot of it has to do with texture and breadth on the palate. If you each one of these things I've mentioned has its own role to play, but with the cold soak, you're getting a lot less tannin or phenolic compounds than you are in alcohol. Alcohol is really good at pulling all those phenolic compounds out. And that's like the rough stuff. And depending on how it's handled, it would, but it builds the middle palate of the wine. And Pinot Noir needs a middle palate. It's a medium-bodied wine, and it is not. You can make the wine seem a lot bigger by really building that up. But I think my bias has always been that the most important thing in Pinot Noir production is balance. And there are years that support a lot of this extraction, and there are years that don't. And you get a year like 03 when you've got one thing, whether you want it or not, which is a lot of alcohol. You've got to have something to balance that out. Tannin helps. Acidity helps a lot. And more flavor and more will help a vintage like that. You get a vintage like one or even this vintage, and you're working with less total material to extract. And I think you have to be very careful that you don't over extract, because then you're going to have something sticking out. That's my perception of what balance is about. you want something that's of a piece. So that after it's been in the bottle a couple of years, it tastes like one thing rather than a bunch of things. And you want them all to kind of fit together nicely. And you got one thing sticking out, like tannin in particular. A good example of that is 84. In 84, the winemakers in Oregon were very concerned about having enough of anything because they were harvesting at like 19, 18 tons. And what some of them did was to press off some of the red wine early and add the skins back to what they were keeping for red wine. And the wines are just almost so tactile. They were just almost unbreakable. There's just a lot of tannin, things that affect the palate. It was very uncomfortable drinking wines. But every vintage is different, and you have to sort of make guesses as you look at your raw product, and then you have to I think, sort of adjust your winemaking to what you've got.
Yeah. If you were to, like somebody that wanted to become a winemaker, what advice would you give that person?
I'm sure you got a lot of money. It's very expensive. I think we spent over $1 million before we even had a winery. You're also in the business where people have a lot of money. Those of us who got in at the beginning, there's not many of us anyway who had very much money, and we had to make it on what we had. And those who then you get people who come in where the investment in the winery is not at all related to their financial success. So, and Domaine Serene would be an example of that. I don't begrudge them any of it. I wish I had the money they had. But I think that you're playing in a game where you've got people who don't need to make any money. They probably do for their ego's sake, but they don't need to, in fact.
Yeah.
So it's important to have enough to make it in that game. It's somewhat of a false economy. I mean, when you're making wine to make a living, it's very different than making wine as a sort of hobby that you're practicing. I think now there's just a lot of people who are sort of at retirement age and want a wine label in their portfolio before they quit working, and we have a lot of people like that now coming to Oregon.
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about. Is like, I was going to ask you about what the culture was like when you started, and then what's the wine culture in Oregon now, and what's the difference?
Well, the wine culture when we got here was there were most of the wine families had been doing something else prior to their becoming winemakers or winery owners, and they didn't have a lot, but they, for the most part, I think had enough to make it, and they were very independent-minded, but they also came to realize very early on that they needed each other. So there was a very strong association by cooperation. Once we started to market wine nationally, we found that going to a state like Florida or New York, you were never going to have enough wine for them. So if you get 3 or 4 wineries to go in together, we're already there, then you can go to a distributor and say, together we can give you enough to satisfy the modest demand that the market's giving us now. We did a lot of marketing in Oregon. I think there's always been a strong, and it probably continues to be true, but it was very strong in the beginning that we were attracting people to this place as much as we were to our wines.
Attracting people, like just not winemakers per se, or wine growers, but just people.
Well, it became part of our marketing. Is that if you could get we always believed if you could get people to come to Oregon, it's much harder to go into their shop in New York when they've never seen Oregon before. We had no sense of what this place is about. But we began to figure out ways to entice them here. And it started really with the International Pinot Noir celebration. And a bunch of us got together and got that going. It's it's always been described as Pinot Camp for wine lovers. And I think had the belief that if we could, part of what would draw them here is the Pinot Noir producers from other parts of the world, especially the Burgundians. And so we get them to come here, and then they would fall in love with the place, and they would take that experience back with them, and that meant that they were more open to buying Pinot Noir in their own locale. And it really worked. And the idea has been used in California. They've got a thing called the World of Pinot Noir. They do, I believe, in spring or late winter in the Santa Barbara area. And it's a direct offshoot of what we did. I mean, they just took a lot of the ideas and adapted them to their wines and situation, and it's been very successful. They've also done the same thing in New Zealand. That's worked very well for them there too.
And we were talking about the wine culture, and like the early wine culture and the wine culture now. Same, different. What are the differences?
Well, one difference is that there's just a whole lot more of us now.
And what difference does that make?
It means that, like when I go to an event, a wine event, where winemakers and winery owners are present. Now, I don't know about a third to a quarter of the people who were there. We were meeting in the beginning, we all knew each other. And we were a pretty tight group. And I think, especially back then, we were very much dependent upon each other's successes and failures. If one of us looked bad, we all looked bad. If one of us looked good, it helped all of us to look good. So that was a pretty strong sense of cooperation and interdependency. But I think that common to both them and now is the fact that we are sandwiched between two wine giants. One huge one to the south and a more modest one to the north, but we are still niche marketers. Pinot Noir is not, it certainly has found its place. I mean, Sideways helped a lot, but Sideways, in essence, expressed something that was already there. I mean, I think America, to the degree that it will, has fallen in love with Pinot Noir. And that makes a big difference. I mean, it's just a lot easier now to sell Pinot Noir. And our struggle at Bethel Heights, like it is with most of the other producers in the state, is that keeping enough wine to satisfy our customer base. We just don't make enough. And it doesn't work to just make more. You have to continue to have a heart for what you're doing and be centered in making a certain quality of product. And you can't just plant more vines. You got to be planted in the right place. You have to be able to manage it and all that sort of thing.
Yeah. When you look back, like in your, I'll call it a career here, it's like, what has like the vineyard taught you about life? Or we can say, what has winemaking taught you about life? Or wine growing, or...
Well, I would say that I think for all of us, I mean, this is our whole family. I think we really learned a lesson about sustainability.
What does that mean?
It essentially means that we can't look at this place as being a dumping ground for chemicals and other inputs that are maybe in the short term going to produce more grapes or more wine, but that we have to look at this place as being self-sustaining. And
over a long period of time.
Over a long period of time. We're talking generations in my mind. It's an issue much bigger than Bethel Heights or even the Oregon wine industry. To me, it's almost a cultural crisis. We believe we can just pick up part of reality here and move it over there. My wife was telling me about a gentleman she met the other day who actually builds islands. There are parts of the world where they've got, hills where they don't want them or whatever, and he goes in and he actually removes the hills and puts them in the ocean or in a lake and creates an island for somebody. And that seems to me to be sort of an extreme of what I'm talking about. But, we want, if we can do it, we would like, for instance, to deal with our insect problems or our pest problems by encouraging predators.
Like
we, for instance, as an example, we had a problem with cutworms here our first year. Cutworm is a little insect that eats the growing tip of the grapevine. And we had the farm service guy come in and he said, well, what you need to do is spray. And you want to spray 7 was the product he suggested, and you get to kill them. And my wife said to all of us, I don't like it. The thing I ask is that we not spray it in the vineyard, at least say one section of it, so we'll see the comparison. So the next year, the only place we didn't have a cutworm problem was the place where we didn't spray. But we killed all the bugs and the rest of the, like Rachel Carlson said many, many years ago. It's just, you're killing off everything. It's not, there's no ecological sense to it. But we have been very involved in the sustainability programs that Oregon has developed. My brother was one of the founders of Oregon Alive, which is the moniker for low-income viticulture and enology. There's a big organic movement in the state of Oregon, and all of agriculture, actually. And I think that's one of the lessons that I've been taught here. But
what about personally? You come as a psychologist and stuff like that. It's like, what kind of lessons have you learned personally out there that you?
Well, there's tremendous satisfaction in the production of something that begins with you taking a stick and putting it in the ground. And every step of the way you're involved in it until you hand the product to somebody who takes it home and enjoys it. I think that's very satisfying. And I think it's good for people like me who are pretty head-oriented to have been involved in something which really requires my physical involvement in the process. And knowing that how we actually work the grapes and farm the vineyard and crush the grapes and barrel it and do all that. Each step of the way actually makes a difference. It's to know a whole dimension of life. And if you worked in building someplace on a campus, university campus or wherever, you wouldn't have any sense of. It makes a difference in the morning when they get up for your harvest, what the weather's going to be. And that's a good thing, I think.
Good in terms of
Emotional well-being, sense of reality.
sense of reality.
It's grounded in a natural process, and with all the vagaries of the weather brings, and even on the other end of wine writers and all that. One lesson you need to learn is that you can't market based on what Robert Parker or Harvey Steinemann is going to say. I mean, if you do, you're going to be in big trouble, because even if they like your wine this year, they may not like it next year. And you need to go out and make friends who will, in essence, be a friend in a vintage that is lauded as the one that you receive all the good reviews for.
Yeah. Check my list here.
Sure.
So what makes, and we'll do two different perspectives on this. What makes Oregon Pinot different than, say, the Pinot from Burgundy or from New Zealand? And then narrowing it down, what makes the Pinot from, we talked about this a little bit, from Eola Hills different than, say, Burgundy or New Zealand?
Well, it's the things we've already talked about, really. I think it's climate on and weather. It's a much broader term. But, it's where you're located in the world and on a continent, and what the humidity is and what the temperatures are. You look at curves of temperature and rainfall and all those things, and you've got a very different climate, for instance, in Burgundy than you do here. It can get warmer, but it's more humid. Like a piece of this is what happens when it gets wet. When it gets wet in Burgundy, when it gets wet in New Zealand, very typically it's pretty warm. And the diseases that we worry about, the fungal diseases, go crazy when it's wet at about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. In Oregon, when it gets wet, it's usually 10 degrees colder than warmer. And the fungal diseases are much less active, if active at all. And that means that disease is not as much of an issue for us. And we don't have to be as afraid of disease. Actually, what we have to be afraid of is heat. Lots of people don't understand that, but Oregon wines to have balance, I think, are best if they're like between 13 and say 13.75 alcohol. And we get vintages like we've had in the last, say, 5 or 6 years. This last year being an exception. Well, 7 is an exception to this. And almost all of our alcohols are over 14%. It's very hard to make, I think, really high quality Pinot Noir with alcohols over 14%. I know a lot of people love wine like that, but it doesn't have the nuance and complexity of a wine that ripens under cooler conditions. Pinot Noir loves to ripen during temperatures of, say, between 70 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. And if it's 85 or 90 out, you're going to get a big buildup of sugar without the commensurate flavor and aroma development. So, and in Burgundy, they get they get a nice balance of that. We probably get more vintages than they do, but I mean that's my bias anyway. But they get that kind of balance enough years that they feel like it's worthwhile continuing to do, and they have been for a long time.
For a little while, yeah.
But in California, there are parts of it that every year it's 26 to 28 bricks, and you have to de-alcoholize or you have to do something with your alcohol, or you got a monster on your hands, and you then adjust your marketing and try to convince people that's what Pinot Noir is supposed to taste. But those of us who really believe in Pinot Noir don't believe in the long run that the public will buy it. Why not just go drink a Syrah or something else that can handle that much alcohol? So I think that's a part of the difference. Differences in the amount of sunlight, like we're quite a bit farther north, and it makes it a difference in terms of we get a lot of light and heat during the beginning and middle of the summer, and then you start watching that sun fall into the southern incline, and you know that you've got to have a vine out there that's positioned on a hillside to intercept the light when it's down there rather than right up above you. And you also know that it makes a difference having older vines, because the older vine has adapted to this climate and is going to be more consistent for you from vintage to vintage with all the vagaries of the weather and all that stuff. So I don't know whether I'm getting the answer to your question. I do think that it's the same factors. It's rainfall, it's temperature, it's slope, it's having a winemaker that knows how all those things work together and is able to make judgments, to take advantage of the possibilities of each kind of vintage. And a grower who knows how to manage his or her plants, like how many leaves do you pull, and how much do you expose the fruit given that vintage, how much crop do you allow yourself to ripen, and that's a tough one, because every year what happens is that we do our crop estimates in late July, early August, and we're having to predict what is going to happen for the rest of the season. But if you try to ripen too much fruit, you're never going to make a great wine.
Because
you're not going to have enough heat and light
to ripen the fruit.
Properly. And that's true for the New Zealanders, and that's true for the Burgundians. The Burgundians do it differently than we do. They set their crop pretty much by the pruning. We do it less here. We do it more with thinning. And
pruning, that's like during the winter, the pruning.
Yes. You leave that X number of buds out per plant, and that's what they're going to get. I actually think there's some wisdom to it, because then you get the plant positioned for if you're a Grand Cru grower, you got a position to make a Grand Cru wine from the very beginning. With us, we try to sort of hedge our bets and put a few more buds out there in hopes that we'll have a Grand Cru vintage, and maybe even a little bit better than that, so that we can ripen more fruit. And then what happens is that you overshoot and you end up with a thin wine that will never be a Grand Cru.
And so you're hedging your bets because you're not sure what October is going to bring?
September, October. That's correct.
What's been, like probably the most difficult thing that you've encountered in your vineyard wine years? Maybe the personal biggest challenge.
Well, this is very personal.
Mm-hmm.
It has to do with the impact of Parkinson's on my winemaking.
And what's that effect?
Well, your olfactory is one of the things that's attacked first by Parkinson's. And so I've had Parkinson's for 11 years, and I have steadily watched my ability to evaluate my wines diminish. And for a while there, I just leaned on my friends to come in and smell my barrels with me. And my brother got very good at it too, so that helped a lot. But 3 or 4 years ago, a young man had been working for me for quite a while as my assistant winemaker, whom I actually give most of the credit for our wines during the time he was here, because he had a great palate and he made up for a lot of what I couldn't do. Then my son came to the force, and he's got, I think, a great palate, and we have in fact worked very well together. His name is Ben. He's 30 years old, graduate of the U of O in philosophy and English.
Took in his father's footsteps, huh?
And great preparation for winemaking.
Or working at McDonald's.
Right. But, I remember when I knew that Rob, the fellow who was here before, was in leave. I talked to the family about what we got to do, and Ben was working as an assistant winemaker at Rex Hill. And I talked to his previous bosses. I'm pretty close to both of them. And they both said he's not ready to be a winemaker yet, but he knows a lot. So I just approached him and I said, this is what the possibility is. You can come to work with me, and then we'll call you assistant winemaker. But when you're ready, you got my job. And he thought about it, and he said, "Well, Dad, the thing that scares the heck out of me is that this may be the last job I ever take." And I said, "Well, I don't want you to think that, because if you need to, if this doesn't work, you should just tell me so, and you can go find a job someplace else. But and we can always hire another winemaker." But he is beginning to love it, and the reality right now is I'm the winemaker emeritus, and he is the winemaker. I mean, this last vintage, I had this whole fill in my head, and they had to schedule it actually in October. It was like 14 days right out of the center of harvest. So Ben made the wines, really, and I think he did an excellent job. So there's ways in which my life is sort of moving on from it. I mean, I will be around here to help him in any way he needs for as long as he needs, God willing. And I'm really proud of him. But it's been a real, it's taught me a lot of things. One thing it's taught me is how great my friends are here. I feel a lot of support from my friends in the Oregon wine industry when I have not been able to do something, them stepping in and helping me out. I think that's just been terrific. It fits with my view of the best way that people can relate to each other, even in a competitive environment. And it's taught me to value my family. And also that we can go through these transitions and still make really good wine. So, and they're not going to be quite the same as they were when I was totally in charge. Because I really wanted Ben to have something to bring to the table, rather than to sort of continue with the family tradition. There is, to some extent, that going on, but that's out of a conversation that we've been having for the last 4 years about what the best way to achieve our goals.
So now, how long has Ben been here?
I think we're just pretty close to, in January, I think it will be 4 years.
4 years? Uh-huh. Will Ben, will he be here in a little while? Because I'd like to get a photograph of the two of you someplace.
He's here right now.
Oh, is he?
I've seen him wandering around.
What does it take to make a really, and this is going to be a little bit redundant, but I'm looking for certain kinds of things. What does it take to make a really great wine? I mean, a really great wine.
Well, the first thing is you have to do everything right. You have to, starting with the growing of the grapes, the timing of everything you do in the vineyard needs to be right, spot on. Like you do your thinning when you've got optimum possibility of improving the quality of the fruit that you don't thin. If you do it too late, then what you're going to get is just minimal improvement. If you do it too early, you may get the berries will just get bigger, and you don't really get the effect you want. You need to harvest at the right time. You need to read that really well. You got to be out there. You have to not only be doing your chemistry to find out what the sugar acid balance is and phenolics and all that stuff, but you've got to feel the fruit and look at the vine and just it's telling you, I'm ready.
When you look at a vine, like what is it specifically that the vine shows that tells that it's ready?
Well, one thing is the fruit gets so soft, and the little basal leaves turn yellow. When you pull the berries off of the stem, they don't take any of the pulp out. The radius of the cluster has turned brown, or is beginning to turn. It's reached brown at a certain point. The seeds inside are brown instead of green. This last year, we ended up picking ripe fruit with some green seeds in it, and that was just a function of the vintage. Maybe that it's also to admit the fact that this isn't quite as ripe a vintage as some of the others that we've had. And everything looks droopier. Mm-hmm. So it's just a sense you have that the vine's done the work that it's going to do. And the other thing is, if you do have any rain, it begins to affect the fruit.
In what way?
Well, it looks a bit more quote-unquote weathered. You're beginning to see some bee damage. The bees are looking for sweetness, and they go in the berry.
The bees are yellow jackets.
There you go. You can see bird damage, although we don't get much of that here. Because the flight patterns of the flocking birds seem to move. I mean, in '84 when we had that terrible vintage, the the sky was absolutely black with birds.
Like starlings?
Starling cedar waxwings. The flocking birds just were here in droves. And you need to have the crop right.
Crop right, what do you mean?
Just enough fruit to ripen so that you aren't overdoing. You can overcrop too. Although I think that's a little overrated. Lots of people think that if you get the crop down too much, then you get an out of balance situation there too. But I think more often than we believe that, for instance, and this is just a general principle, that we should try to keep the crop down around 2 tons per acre. That's given how much soil and the kind of exposure and such that we have. 2 tons per acre works really well in building concentration in the wines. And we take everything to 1 cluster per shoot. So each shoot out there is only trying to ripen 1 cluster. We take off the shoulders and wings, so the cluster is just 1 single pine cone shaped fruit. And but we go to 1 cluster per shoot in some vintages, and we have 3 tons per acre still. So then we got to go back and take off more.
And that's because of like water content or just the size of the cluster?
Probably both, but it really has to do with the number of berries. In other words, how fruitful the vine was that year. You know, there's big differences in how much the clusters weigh. You have a perfectly dry year and have clusters that are much heavier than they are in other years. If some of it, like what has to do with flower, and if every little flower out there becomes a berry, you're gonna have something a lot heavier than you do if you have less than successful flower and half the flowers turn into berries. And we have methodology to predict that. The clusters go into what we call a lag phase, and that's when the seeds are fully formed, and when you put a knife through it, it's actually resisting the knife rather than cutting through it. Like it's just like flesh. And so we call it the beginning of lag phase, and there's about a 2-week period right in the middle of the season that when you take the weights and you multiply it by 2 or approximately by 2, gives you your final cluster weight. And that's our way of having a sense of how much fruit we're going to have that year.
And that's what you do in July then?
End of July, beginning of August. And so, you know, it's a question of how good you were at that, how careful you were, how lucky you were. So it's all those things together that add up to how well you've done it. And, therefore, what kind of success you're going to have.
What are some myths of Oregon wine?
Well, one of them I think has to do with this rain thing, and that was certainly true in some of the publicity about 07. I think there was a group of California winemakers who came up here, took a look around at the beginning of the vintage, and said, it's going to be a disaster. Because they were used to their situation, which has to do with the rain at a very different temperature than we have. We saw very little rot here, and we harvested all the way up until probably the 25th of October. And I was at a friend's winery yesterday, and he's still pressing it. And has still things active in the fermenters. and it's pretty late.
Yeah.
But that's a big myth. I think the myth is that rain affected vintages are vintages when you have X number of days of rain, and I think that in fact it's more something where you just have to keep your eye on the weather and continue to go out after each rainstorm and see what difference it's making.
Yeah.
Because it's not going to be as much as you expect, and it's more something where I think you need to judge it at each vineyard site what the impact is. And the bigger problem is, I believe, heat. Oregon has what I would call drought conditions during July and August almost every year. We have less than half an inch of rain per month in July and August.
Yeah.
That's the biggest myth.
So the myth is that people think that it's raining here, and actually, a lot of years it's almost just the opposite.
Exactly.
Yeah. I was talking with Roland Souls. I can't remember if it was yesterday or the day before, and he told me to ask you about the myths.
About myths.
Yeah. And he chuckled when he said that.
Yeah, Roland. Well, this is a little, it's not nearly as important, but one myth I think is that there's a couple people at the Wine Spectator who always looked at Oregon as sort of the Berkeley of the American wine industry. Which is sort of, they were overly intellectual and are not grounded enough in anything else to make good wine. I think that's, granted we may have started out that way, but I think that we wore off the Berkeley sheen pretty early, and the people who are, I think, making the best wine in Oregon right now are folks who are both very involved in their winemaking and their growing, and pay attention to both on a day-by-day basis. Because the growing is extremely important here. I don't know, if you look back at your notes, I would say that there'll be a very significant number of things you've asked me about when I talk about the vineyard. I really believe that you make the wines in the vineyard, and if you don't do your job in the vineyard, you seriously won't be able to do it in wine. Or if you have to do a lot in the wine, you're dealing with the diminished end product. And the other myth probably is that, related to that, is that the winemaker is a lot more important than anybody else in the company, and in fact that is not true. Dealing with good growers, quality growers is really a major contributor. If you can count on people to do things he or she says they're going to do it, and be in communication with them, given what you want to do to have that happen. It's not a natural thing to have happen. It's not.
What's not a natural thing to have happen?
Well, I think it's not natural for people to communicate that well. I mean, some of it has to do with the people who get into this business in the first place. They're very independent people. But it's not good to be independent-minded when it comes around to trying to accomplish something as complex as making good wine. My brother and I have really had to work at this.
In terms of communication?
Absolutely. I mean, when it's harvest time, for the first few years, Ted would just come in and tell me, X and Y and Z is true about the vineyard it's time to pick. And then I began to realize that his goal was to get the grapes off as soon as he possibly could, because then he could go play golf. And he also believed that the prettiest fruit, the most elegant looking fruit, was the best for grapes, for wine. And in fact, you have to often go a little bit beyond that to get the full flavor. So we began to, then we made a commitment to do all that work in the vineyard together. So we would go out and walk the vineyard, and then we began to sort of form the list of things that were important to us in the fruit to determine ripeness. And we then had a language that we shared to talk about. And that has made a huge difference. Some situations, the grower and the winemaker are one person, and I think that works really well too. But it's also very hard when you've got like 5 or 6 growers, and they each have their own stake and their fruit looking X way, and their vineyard being whatever.
That's like you're pulling fruit from other growers.
Right. And we've kind of come to the conclusion that, as a general rule, we'll try to grow all of our own grapes. We don't do that now, but we just bought another piece of property north of here by Hopewell that will add 80 acres to our capacity. And what I've been working with my brother and my son about is they're beginning to develop a way to communicate. My son's a little intimidated. He's probably one of the best growers in the state of Oregon, and he's extremely well read. And Ben is just pig-headed. I think he'll But that's a hard one. I can't help him do that too much. He needs to get to the point where he's able to say no too.
Kind of get that confidence.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, doesn't that just kind of come with time and just doing things for a number of years? And if
right.
you haven't been, you should be telling me about psychology here.
Well, psychology, my background in it has certainly helped. But
it helped in what way? That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Well, I think it hasn't helped me in the sense of, I think I understand a lot of how people relate to each other, and I can see a lot of mistakes or whatever that people make in trying to communicate. And I think that's helped me immeasurably in being able to work with people and all of that. But you talk about that too much, and it sounds like people who have a background in psychology are being able to pull strings or manipulate situations. And the truth of the matter is, what psychology teaches you is it doesn't work. So you just try to be as genuine as you can. I want to go back to something.
Okay.
I don't know. I know what Ron was talking about the myth.
Okay.
And this is a story, actually. And I'll tell it to you.
Okay.
and that is that approximately a month ago, there was in the back pages of some of the publications here in Oregon and also in the Middle East, a story that indicated that they had unearthed materials that suggested that Odysseus actually had further travels than was indicated in the book.
Uh-huh.
And in fact, he had actually rounded the Cape into the Pacific Ocean.
Mm.
And followed up the west coast of South America and began to enter into North America, and actually came to a part of the coast that they call the land of the tall trees. And they just noticed huge green conifers all along the coast. And about that time, they began to hear something in the background that was sort of drawing them along. And what they realized is that it began to get strong enough that when they came to the opening, a huge opening in the land that was the entrance to a river, they were compelled to have their boat go up the river. And they followed the river up a ways and then realized that they were being drawn into another river and turned their boat into that. And now it was getting to be very strong. And they followed that river up another, say, 25 to 30 miles. And it was like a siren at that point. And they couldn't resist it, so they threw the anchor in and swam ashore and began to climb up into the hills. And when they reached the top, and there was a piece of flat ground, they realized that there was a warm breeze blowing through a solid granite harp. And it was an Aeolian harp. And it was just keeping it there. And very shortly thereafter, there came out of the trees people, and they were very friendly and very welcoming. And they began to, and these people realized what was going on with them, although they didn't know it themselves at the time. But they welcomed them back into the place where they lived, and had a huge feast. And the feast included a beverage that they named black pie in their language, and they were able to communicate by hand signals and everything, the kind of thing, to Odysseus and his men. And it was just like an elixir. They never tasted anything like it before. So they'd sit around for weeks, and Odysseus began to realize that they would probably never leave, because they were so entranced by both the music and by the beverage and just the friendliness of the people. And so he talked to their leader, whose name was Paul, that he said, Odysseus said, we need to leave, but I don't think we can. And what Paul suggested is that they take the grapes from the plant and stuff it in their ears so that it blocked out the sound. And they did that, and they got back on their ship and, in a sense, escaped the siren. They had many adventures between there and returning to Asia Minor, where their home was, and returned home and felt very good about the whole experience they'd had. And then one morning, Odysseus got up I looked at his pillow, and lying on his pillow were some seeds that had fallen out of his ear. And they then knew what they were, and they gathered them up as best they could and began to cultivate them. And over time, the fame of this wonderful beverage spread, and it worked its way up into Europe. And eventually it was cultivated in an area that was eventually to be called Burgundy. And after the New World was discovered, some people brought the vines from Burgundy to this place, the New World, and eventually they were found to grow best in Oregon. But the myth is that that they actually came from Burgundy, but in fact the original home was on a hillside in Oregon.
That's good. I especially like stuffing the grapes in the ears. That's great.
Well, this occurred to me in the shower one morning, and I was coming here to do a tasting with a bunch of winemakers for one of our events, and Roland was here, and he heard that, and I think that's what he was talking about. But
it sounds like it, yeah. It's really funny because, the first question I asked you, what was the siren's call that called you to,
right?
And I didn't know anything. Roland didn't. He just said, ask him about myths. It's like I do a bunch of stuff with myths, like in African stuff, and so that's why Roland and I would talk about a lot of that kind of stuff. And so that's interesting how that was, like a 360. Great
right.
story. I like that. So that came in a shower, huh?
It came in a shower.
Not a rain shower, but a inside shower.
An inside shower.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Terry, I think that's, it's like, is there anything else that, that I need to know?
Golly, we've talked about a lot of stuff. I don't think so. I mean, if you leave me your card, if something comes up, I'll just send you an email.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that. This was a real treat for me.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it's a real treat.
Treat for me too.
Yeah. And the amazing thing for me is, it's like I've been talking with a number of different people, and it's like I'm really beginning to kind of appreciate the history. It's like I've even talked with Richard Summer down, and some of the people that we don't normally hear about.
I'm glad you're talking to people like Richard.
Yeah.
I mean, Richard is Richard's a person who was, I think, ended up. He talk about independent. I mean, he is very much that. He's also a very sweet person. And I remember being in a meeting with him down in Southern Oregon, and we gave him a ride home, my wife and I, and he was interested in the kind of problems we were having, and he began to really try to help us think through the things that we were maybe doing wrong or whatever. And just a great guy, but probably clinically a little crazy, but I see that as a plus.
In what way?
Oh, I think it's just that he's got a little bit different perspective, and it's not helped his business out a lot. I think he's made a lot of mistakes there, but as a person, he's just a real sweet man, and I'm really proud to have been in an industry with him. He's a really good human being.
Yeah. I spent a day and a half with him, and it was just interesting. It's like we were out down in that Umpqua area, and we were going to some harvests at that time, and even the guys that were picking knew him.
Oh, yeah.
And just like you could tell there was a tremendous amount of respect for this this guy with the Einstein hair, and a tremendous amount of respect. But it's like even early on that guy, I mean, he did a lot of thinking about where was a good place. It wasn't like, he just, said, well, I'm going to just do it here on a whim. It's like he did a fair amount of research.
Yes.
Yeah. It's been interesting.
Oh, I'm sure it has been.
Yeah, so I'm really kind of appreciating the history, and that's why one of the themes that I'm working on is like I call it first generation. I'm passing the thief to the second generation, and that's why I'd like to get a photograph of you and your son.
That's him.
All right.